The moment a human speaks to a princess in the Australian Empire, history changes. I didn't know that law when I first stepped into the royal atrium, but I was about to learn it the hard way. The air inside the palace shimmered with a faint metallic warmth, like electricity humming through crystal. Massive pillars of translucent stone stretched nearly 80 feet toward a vaulted ceiling where slow rivers of violet light drifted like northern lights trapped indoors. I stood near a maintenance console at the edge of the hall, wiping reactor coolant from my gloves and trying not to stare at everything around me. Back on Earth, I was just a salvage engineer from Ohio, the kind of guy who fixed broken engines and patched hull leaks with duct tape and stubbornness. Out here, in the capital palace of an interstellar empire, I was supposed to be invisible. Humans were contractors, mechanics, technicians, useful, tolerated, but never important. The Australians moved through the hall with quiet grace, tall figures with luminous blue skin that reflected the palace lights like polished glass. Their silver uniforms carried symbols I couldn't read, but even I could tell the difference between nobles and attendants. The nobles walked like gravity itself made room for them. I kept my head down, running diagnostics on a power conduit the size of a pickup truck, pretending the numbers on my tablet were the most fascinating thing in the galaxy. That's when the music changed. A low harmonic tone rolled through the chamber, deep enough to vibrate in my chest. Every alien in the room stopped moving at once. Conversations ended mid-sentence. Even the lights seemed to dim slightly, focusing toward the far end of the hall. Someone whispered a word my translator barely caught. Princess. I looked up before I could stop myself. She entered through an archway nearly 30 feet tall, walking slowly along a raised path of crystal steps. At first all I noticed was the color. Her skin carried a softer shade of blue than the others, almost like the sky just after sunset. Her hair flowed behind her like strands of pale starlight, shifting gently with each step. The crown she wore wasn't heavy or jeweled like something from an old Earth movie. Instead it looked grown, delicate arcs of silver metal that hovered just above her head, emitting a faint halo of light. Every noble in the hall bowed their heads. Every single one. Except me. I was too stunned to remember I was supposed to. The princess moved with calm confidence, her posture straight, her gaze forward, as if she'd walked this path 1,000 times. And maybe she had. The entire hall watched her like she was gravity itself. I leaned slightly toward the technician beside me, a tall Australian who'd been supervising my repair work. The words slipped out of my mouth before my brain could catch them. She's the most magnificent princess I've ever seen. It wasn't loud, barely more than a whisper, but in that perfectly silent hall, it might as well have been shouted through a loudspeaker. The technician beside me went completely still. Slowly, he turned his head toward me with an expression that looked like pure disbelief. Human, he murmured under his breath. You were not supposed to say that. My stomach dropped. And then, 200 feet away across the glowing atrium, the princess stopped walking. For one long heartbeat, the entire palace held its breath. Then she turned. Her golden eyes scanned the hall once, calm and searching, before locking directly onto me. For a few seconds I forgot how to breathe. Hundreds of Australian nobles stood perfectly still around the atrium, their luminous blue faces turned toward the princess, yet her attention was no longer on them. It was on me. 50 yards across the polished crystal floor, her golden eyes held mine with calm curiosity, as if the rest of the galaxy had suddenly faded into the background. I could feel the technician beside me stiffen like a statue. The soft hum of the palace power grid echoed through the chamber, vibrating faintly beneath my boots. I had spent my entire life around machines, reactors, and cargo ships, but nothing in my experience prepared me for the silence of that moment. In the Australian Empire, humans were temporary visitors. We repaired things, we delivered cargo, we occasionally helped expand trade routes, but we were never meant to be noticed. And yet I had just spoken out loud about the most important person in the room. The technician leaned closer to me, his voice barely more than air moving between his teeth. He said that the royal procession never paused for anyone. Not once in recorded history. My stomach sank about 2 inches deeper when I realized that the princess was no longer walking. She stood at the center of the illuminated path, the light from the palace ceiling drifting slowly around her like floating ribbons. Her expression did not look angry. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, she studied me with quiet interest, the way a scientist might observe a strange new discovery. The nobles around her shifted slightly, confused by the pause in the ceremony. One of them whispered something that my translator struggled to interpret. It sounded like the word irregular. I suddenly became very aware that I was the only human in the entire hall. I was 6 feet tall, wearing a gray maintenance jacket with coolant stains on the sleeve, standing in a palace designed for beings who looked like living sculptures. If there was ever a moment when I wished I could disappear behind a toolbox, this was it. The princess tilted her head slightly, her silver crown catching the light like a faint halo. Even from across the atrium, I could see a spark of curiosity in her eyes. Slowly she stepped off the ceremonial path. The movement was small, but it caused an immediate ripple through the hall. Several nobles straightened, clearly uncertain whether they were supposed to follow. Instead of continuing toward the throne platform, the princess walked in my direction. Each step was calm and deliberate, her long stride covering the distance with surprising speed. The technician next to me quietly stepped back half a pace as if distance might protect him from whatever mistake I had just made. My heartbeat sounded like a drum in my ears. I counted the seconds without meaning to. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. The princess stopped a few feet away from where I stood beside the reactor console. Up close, she was even taller than I expected, nearly 7 feet from the polished floor to the delicate arc of silver above her head. Her blue skin glowed softly in the palace light, and her golden eyes reflected the faint scrolling data from my repair tablet. She looked at the coolant stains on my gloves, then at the open power conduit beside me, and finally back to my face. When she spoke, her voice carried a calm musical tone that echoed gently through the silent hall. She asked me if it was true, that humans always speak their thoughts out loud when they see something beautiful. Every noble in the chamber waited for my answer. For a moment I wondered if my translator had malfunctioned. Her voice was calm, almost curious, yet the question hung in the air like a test no one had prepared me for. Every Australian in the chamber stood frozen, their glowing eyes shifting between the princess and the human mechanic who had somehow become the center of the royal ceremony. My throat felt dry, but running away was not an option. I had fixed reactors in asteroid storms and patched hull breaches, while oxygen alarms screamed in my ears. Talking to a princess should not have been the hardest moment of my career. Still, my heartbeat sounded loud enough that I was sure the palace sensors could hear it. I cleared my throat slowly and tried to remember that honesty usually worked better than pretending to be smarter than I was. I told her that humans do not always say what they think, but sometimes the words slip out when we see something that surprises us. The princess watched me closely while I spoke, her golden eyes steady and thoughtful. The soft glow of the palace lights reflected across her blue skin like sunlight on water. I realized she was studying every detail, the way my voice sounded, the way my hands moved while I spoke, even the way I stood beside the power conduit with a maintenance tablet still clutched in one hand. When I finished speaking, she tilted her head slightly, considering my answer. Around us the nobles remained silent, clearly unsure whether they were witnessing a mistake or the beginning of something unusual. After a few seconds the princess asked another question, and this time there was a faint hint of amusement in her voice. She asked me whether I always compliment strangers while repairing energy systems inside royal palaces. I felt heat creep up the back of my neck, the same embarrassed feeling I used to get in high school when a teacher caught me talking during class. I admitted that this was the first time I had ever worked inside a palace, and definitely the first time I had accidentally spoken to a princess. A quiet ripple moved through the hall as several nobles exchanged confused glances. The princess looked toward the open power conduit beside me, where glowing lines of energy flowed through the transparent housing like rivers of light. She asked if the repair was important. I explained that the conduit controlled part of the palace environmental system, and if the alignment was off by even half an inch the energy flow could become unstable. I pointed to the diagnostic display and told her that the calibration was nearly finished. She stepped slightly closer to the console and studied the glowing readings with genuine interest. For someone raised in royal halls, she seemed unusually curious about something as ordinary as maintenance work. She asked how a human learned to repair technology built by a species that had traveled the stars for thousands of years. I shrugged and told her that machines usually follow the same basic rules no matter who builds them. Power flows from one place to another, systems stay balanced or they break, and sometimes all it takes to fix a complicated problem is someone willing to look closely at it. The princess smiled faintly at that answer. It was not a grand royal smile meant for ceremonies. It was small and genuine, like she had just heard a perspective no one around her had ever offered before. Behind her the nobles stood stiff and uncertain, watching their princess speak calmly with a human technician beside a glowing reactor conduit. After a moment, she turned her golden gaze back to me and asked a question that made the entire hall grow even quieter. She asked if humans always notice small things that everyone else ignores. I considered the question for a moment while the quiet hum of the palace systems vibrated through the floor beneath my boots. Her golden eyes were steady, waiting for an honest answer, not the kind of careful response someone might give to royalty. I rubbed a little coolant residue from my glove against my pant leg and said that humans probably do notice small things more than we realize, mostly because we have to. I explained that back on Earth I worked salvage jobs where a loose bolt the size of a coin could mean the difference between a ship returning home or drifting helplessly through space. Machines do not care how advanced you think you are. If a tiny component fails, the entire system can collapse. The princess listened closely, her head tilted, slightly as if she were collecting each word like a puzzle piece. Around us the nobles were still watching, their tall forms perfectly still beneath the glowing ceiling lights. Some of them looked confused, others looked uncomfortable, as if the normal rhythm of palace life had been interrupted by something unpredictable. The princess glanced briefly toward the open conduit beside me, where soft bands of blue energy pulsed through the transparent chamber. She asked if humans learn patience from working with machines. I thought about that and told her that machines do teach patience, but they also teach humility. When a system fails, it does not matter how important someone thinks they are. The only thing that matters is understanding the problem and fixing it carefully. A faint smile returned to her face, the kind that suggested she found the idea interesting rather than amusing. She said that in her experience, most people in the palace prefer large solutions and grand strategies rather than small, careful observations. I shrugged slightly and said that humans are not usually given the chance to control grand strategies, so we get good at paying attention to details instead. The princess studied my face for a few seconds as if that explanation answered a question she had been thinking about for a long time. The light from the crystal ceiling drifted slowly across the atrium, reflecting softly off the polished floor and the tall pillars that framed the chamber. In the distance I could hear the faint hum of the palace climate systems adjusting as my repair finished calibrating. My diagnostic display blinked green, confirming that the conduit alignment was now stable within less than a quarter-inch tolerance. I reached toward the console to seal the access panel when the princess spoke again. She asked if humans ever grow tired of fixing problems created by others. The question surprised me enough that I paused with my hand hovering over the panel latch. I told her that sometimes we do get tired, but solving problems is also what keeps things moving forward. If no one fixes what is broken, then nothing improves. For a moment, she looked thoughtful, her golden eyes reflecting the pale blue glow of the reactor conduit. Then she asked something that made the surrounding nobles shift uneasily where they stood. She asked if I believed that even an empire could have small problems that everyone else was ignoring. The question lingered in the air longer than any of the others. Even the faint humming of the palace systems seemed quieter, as if the entire atrium was waiting to hear what a human mechanic might say about the problems of an empire that had ruled the stars for thousands of years. I slowly lowered my hand from the console panel and looked back at the princess. Her golden eyes were calm, but serious now, not curious in the same way they had been moments earlier. I could feel the attention of every noble in the chamber pressing in from all directions. Speaking carelessly now would probably be a mistake, but pretending I knew nothing would also be dishonest. I took a breath and told her that every system has small problems, no matter how advanced it appears. On Earth we used to say that even the most powerful machine can fail if the smallest piece is ignored for too long. I gestured lightly toward the conduit beside us, explaining that this entire palace climate system depended on hundreds of small components working together perfectly. If one sensor drifted out of alignment by even a quarter inch, It might not cause trouble immediately, but over time the imbalance could grow. Eventually, the system would stop working the way it was designed to. The princess listened without interrupting, her posture straight and thoughtful. The nobles behind her exchanged uneasy glances, as if the conversation itself had stepped into territory that no one expected a human to explore. I continued carefully, saying that the same idea probably applies to organizations, governments, and even empires. Small misunderstandings, overlooked details, or voices that are never heard can slowly build pressure inside any system. Most of the time those problems are invisible because everyone assumes the structure is too strong to be affected by something small. The princess looked down briefly at the glowing lines of energy inside the conduit and then back at me. The faint palace lights reflected across her crown in soft arcs of silver. She asked if humans really believe that small voices can change something as large as a civilization. I thought about the question for a moment before answering. I said that humans might not always succeed, but we tend to believe that small actions matter. Most of our history was built by people who were not powerful or important when they started. Farmers, mechanics, teachers, explorers. People who simply noticed something wrong and decided to try fixing it instead of ignoring it. The princess grew very still after hearing that. For a few seconds, she said nothing, and the silence stretched across the atrium like a held breath. Then a thoughtful expression crossed her face, the kind that suggested she had been searching for an answer long before this conversation began. Finally, she spoke again, her voice calm, but carrying clearly through the chamber. She said that the Australian Empire had spent centuries listening only to the largest voices in the room. Generals, senators, and noble houses that believed strength and authority were the only ways to guide the future. Slowly, she turned her gaze toward the hundreds of nobles watching from the surrounding floor. Then she looked back at me and said something that made the technician beside me shift nervously where he stood. She said that perhaps the Empire had forgotten to listen to the smallest voices of all. The words seemed to settle across the palace floor like dust in still air. No one moved. The nobles who had spent their entire lives speaking with authority now stood silent, their luminous blue faces reflecting uncertainty beneath the drifting light of the crystal ceiling. I could feel the tension without even looking around. Something had shifted in the room, and everyone knew it. The princess remained standing beside the reactor console, calm and composed, but the meaning behind her statement was impossible to ignore. She had just suggested that the Empire might be overlooking voices that had never been considered important before. I suddenly became very aware that I was still holding a maintenance tablet in my hand, like a confused technician who had wandered into the wrong meeting. I cleared my throat quietly and sealed the conduit access panel with a soft metallic click. The palace climate system responded immediately, the faint airflow in the chamber adjusting as the calibrated conduit balanced the energy flow. My diagnostic display confirmed that the system was now running perfectly within safe parameters. It felt strangely comforting to focus on something simple and mechanical for a second. Machines were easier than politics. The princess watched the console lights settle into their steady rhythm, and I noticed the faintest trace of satisfaction in her expression. Then she turned her gaze back toward the nobles gathered throughout the atrium. Her posture remained relaxed, but the attention of the entire hall followed her every movement. I realized that whatever happened next would probably be remembered long after my repair work was forgotten. One of the senior nobles finally stepped forward from the edge of the ceremonial platform. His uniform carried several layered insignias that marked him as someone important, though I had no idea what the symbols actually meant. He spoke carefully, choosing his words the way someone might step across thin ice. He said that the Empire had always valued wisdom and experience in guiding its decisions. His tone suggested that voices from outside the traditional structure might not fully understand the responsibilities carried by those in power. The princess listened without interrupting. When he finished, she simply asked whether wisdom can grow if it never hears new perspectives. The noble hesitated for a moment before answering. The pause alone was enough to send another ripple of quiet through the chamber. I shifted my weight slightly, trying to remain invisible again, but the princess glanced briefly in my direction as if reminding the room why this conversation had started in the first place. She explained calmly that the human technician beside the reactor had not spoken with authority or ambition. He had simply answered questions honestly, describing how complex systems depend on small details that others often overlook. Then she looked across the atrium once more and said that perhaps the strength of an empire is not measured only by the power of its largest voices, but also by its willingness to listen to the smallest ones. The nobles stood motionless under the glowing ceiling while her words settled into the silence. I did not know what would happen next. I only knew that a simple repair job had somehow turned into a conversation that the entire empire was now forced to hear. The silence that followed felt heavier than the thick crystal pillars rising 80 feet above the palace floor. No one in the atrium seemed quite sure how to respond to what had just been said. The nobles stood in quiet rows beneath the drifting violet light, their attention shifting between the princess and the human technician who had somehow become part of a conversation meant for emperors and senators. I tried to focus on the steady hum of the reactor conduit beside me, letting the familiar rhythm of machinery calm my thoughts. Machines were predictable. People, especially powerful people, were not. The princess remained where she stood, calm and composed, her hands loosely folded behind her back. Her golden eyes moved slowly across the chamber, studying the expressions of the nobles, as if she were reading a long history written across their faces. Some of them looked thoughtful. Others looked uncertain. A few looked uncomfortable, the way people do when an idea challenges something they have always believed. Finally, another voice spoke from the far side of the hall. This noble was older than most of the others, his blue skin carrying a faint silver pattern that marked decades of service to the empire. He stepped forward with careful dignity and bowed his head slightly to the princess before speaking. His voice was calm but firm. He said that the empire had survived for centuries because its leaders relied on structure and discipline. Decisions were made by those trained to understand the vast responsibilities of guiding entire star systems. He suggested that listening to every small voice might create confusion rather than strength. The princess listened respectfully, allowing him to finish without interruption. When he stopped speaking, she walked a few slow steps toward the center of the atrium, the soft light following her movement across the polished floor. She did not appear offended by the noble's concern. Instead, she seemed thoughtful, as if the comment had given her something important to consider. I stood quietly beside the sealed reactor panel, hoping that no one would suddenly ask me another question. Unfortunately, the princess glanced in my direction again. She asked me something that made the technician beside me inhale sharply. She asked whether humans ever solve problems by listening to people who are not experts. I hesitated for a moment, aware that hundreds of alien eyes were now focused on the answer of a mechanic from Earth. I said that experts are important because they understand complex systems better than most people. But sometimes the person closest to a problem sees something that experts overlook. A farmer might notice a pattern in the soil before a scientist does. A mechanic might hear a strange vibration in an engine before a computer detects it. I explained that humans often rely on a mixture of knowledge and observation. Sometimes the best solutions come from combining both. The princess listened carefully, then turned back toward the gathered nobles. She explained that the empire had extraordinary knowledge, advanced science, and centuries of experience guiding its civilization. But knowledge alone could not guarantee wisdom if it stopped growing. Her voice carried calmly through the chamber as she said that even the most powerful system must remain open to new perspectives, or it eventually becomes rigid and fragile. As her words settled into the quiet hall, I realized something strange. I had arrived at the palace to repair a conduit that was barely 2 feet wide. Yet somehow that small repair had opened a conversation about the future of an empire that stretched across thousands of light years. The quiet that followed her words was different from the silence before. Earlier it had felt like confusion. Now it felt like something shifting beneath the surface, like the first movement of machinery that had been still for too long. The nobles remained standing beneath the drifting lights of the palace ceiling, but their expressions were no longer as certain as when the ceremony had begun. Some of them were watching the princess with thoughtful attention. Others were studying me as if they had just realized a human mechanic was standing in the middle of a conversation meant for rulers of star systems. I tried not to look back at them. I focused instead on the steady glow of the reactor conduit beside me, the transparent chamber showing smooth bands of blue energy flowing exactly where they were supposed to. When machines worked properly, they created a kind of quiet confidence. I wish people worked that way too. The princess took a few slow steps across the atrium floor, the faint reflection of the crystal ceiling sliding across her silver crown. She was not speaking now, but it was clear that everyone in the hall was still listening to her. After a moment, she stopped near the center of the chamber and turned again toward the gathered nobles. Her posture was calm, but there was a new weight to the way she held herself, as if the conversation had grown larger than the ceremony that had brought them all here. She explained that the empire had always celebrated strength, intelligence, and unity among its worlds. Those qualities had allowed the Australian people to travel across thousands of light years and build alliances with dozens of civilizations. But she said that strength also carries a quiet responsibility. A civilization that becomes too confident in its own perfection may stop noticing the small signals that something needs to change. As she spoke, I noticed the older noble who had questioned her earlier standing with his hands folded behind his back. His expression had softened slightly, the lines around his eyes suggesting that he was listening more carefully now than before. The princess continued by saying that the conversation they were having did not begin with a political speech or a council debate. It began with a small observation from someone who had no authority at all. A human technician repairing a conduit had answered simple questions honestly. She said that honesty had reminded her of something important. Systems remain strong when they allow new information to enter. Systems fail when they close themselves off. A quiet murmur moved through the chamber, not disagreement, but recognition. I shifted my weight slightly, wishing again that I could fade back into the background. I had come here expecting to spend the afternoon calibrating power conduits and submitting a repair report before returning to my transport ship. Instead, I was standing beside the princess of an interstellar empire while she discussed the future of her civilization. The princess finally turned toward me once more, her golden eyes thoughtful but warm. She said that humans were a young species compared to the Australians, yet they had expanded across their own solar system with surprising speed. She asked if curiosity played a role in that progress. I nodded slowly and told her that curiosity is probably one of the strongest instincts humans have. We explore, we ask questions, and sometimes we say things out loud before we realize how important they might be. A faint smile returned to her face at that answer. Then she looked back across the vast atrium and said something that made every noble in the room listen even more closely. She said that curiosity might be the smallest voice in the galaxy, but it has a way of changing the future of everyone who chooses to hear it. The quiet in the atrium did not feel fragile anymore. It felt steady, like the calm moment after a complicated machine finally settles into balance. The nobles remained where they stood beneath the towering crystal pillars, but the tension that had filled the hall earlier was gone. Instead, there was a thoughtful stillness, the kind that appears when people realize they have just witnessed something meaningful. I stood beside the sealed reactor conduit, my maintenance tablet resting loosely in my hand, still trying to process how a routine repair had turned into a moment that might shape the direction of an entire empire. The soft energy flow inside the conduit continued its steady hum beneath the polished floor panels, a quiet reminder that small adjustments can restore balance to even the most complex systems. The princess remained near the center of the chamber, her posture calm and composed. The silver arcs of her crown glowed faintly beneath the drifting lights above as she slowly looked across the assembled nobles. She seemed to be studying them not as rulers and officials, but as individuals, each carrying their own understanding of the empire they served. After allowing another moment of silence, she spoke again with the same calm clarity that had guided the conversation since it began. She said that every civilization reaches moments when it must decide whether to remain comfortable with the structures it has always known or continue evolving with the changing universe around it. The Australian Empire had grown strong through unity, knowledge, and exploration, yet those strengths would only remain meaningful if the empire continued to listen and learn. Her voice carried easily through the hall, not commanding but thoughtful, like someone inviting others to look at something from a new angle. The older noble who had spoken earlier stepped forward once again, though this time there was no tension in his expression. He bowed his head respectfully and said that the empire had always believed it understood the galaxy well because it had studied so many civilizations. Yet perhaps it had spent so much time observing others that it had forgotten to observe itself with the same curiosity. His words caused a quiet murmur of agreement among several nobles nearby. The princess nodded slightly, acknowledging the honesty of his reflection. Then she turned her gaze toward the tall windows lining the far side of the atrium, where distant stars glowed softly beyond the palace walls. She said that the galaxy is vast, filled with countless worlds and species each, discovering their own path through time. No civilization, no matter how advanced, can claim to understand everything. That is why curiosity must never disappear. It is the force that keeps knowledge alive. I watched the nobles as they listened. Many of them seemed thoughtful now rather than skeptical, their earlier certainty replaced by the quiet awareness that even powerful traditions can grow stronger through reflection. The princess finally turned back toward me one last time. Her golden eyes carried a warmth that was different from the curiosity she had shown earlier. She thanked me again for speaking honestly when she asked her questions. She said that sometimes the most valuable perspective is the one that arrives without ambition, without ceremony, simply through observation. Then she looked across the chamber and addressed the nobles one final time. She said that the empire would continue to rely on wisdom, experience, and strength as it always had. But from this moment forward, it must also remember something simple. Even the smallest voice in a vast system might notice the first sign that something important is ready to change. And if that voice is heard instead of ignored, an entire civilization may discover a better way forward. The atrium remained silent after the princess finished speaking, but the silence now carried a sense of quiet understanding rather than uncertainty. The nobles stood beneath the towering crystal pillars while the drifting lights above reflected gently across the polished floor. No one seemed eager to break the moment. It felt as though the entire empire had paused for a single breath. I remained beside the sealed conduit panel, the faint vibration of balanced energy continuing beneath the floor. My repair work had been finished for several minutes now, yet leaving felt strangely difficult. Something meaningful had unfolded here, something far larger than the maintenance report waiting on my tablet. The princess stood calmly at the center of the chamber, her golden eyes moving slowly across the assembled nobles. There was no triumph in her expression and no sense of victory. Instead, there was quiet certainty, the kind that comes from recognizing a truth rather than winning an argument. The older noble stepped forward once more, but this time he did not question her. Instead, he bowed his head deeply, a gesture of respect that carried through the chamber like a signal. Several other nobles followed his example. The movement spread gradually across the atrium until dozens of officials and advisors stood with their heads lowered in thoughtful acknowledgement. It was not submission. It was recognition. The princess watched them quietly for a moment before lifting one hand slightly, a gentle signal that the ceremony could continue. The tension that had once filled the hall had vanished. In its place remained a calm atmosphere that felt almost hopeful. Slowly the nobles began to move again, their quiet conversations returning as the formal gathering resumed its natural rhythm. The empire had not changed in a dramatic instant. No new laws had been declared, and no grand proclamations had been issued. Yet something subtle had shifted in the way the room felt. It was the difference between a rigid structure and one that had just discovered it could adjust. I glanced down at the conduit panel beside me and ran a quick final diagnostic on the tablet. The system remained perfectly aligned, energy flowing smoothly through the chamber exactly as it was designed to. Small adjustment. Balanced system. The idea seemed strangely fitting now. When I looked up again, the princess was standing a few steps away. The palace lights reflected softly in her silver crown as she studied the repaired console for a moment. Then she looked back at me. Her voice was quiet when she spoke, meant only for someone standing a few feet away. She said that the Empire often searches the galaxy for discoveries among distant stars, yet today it had discovered something much closer. A reminder that understanding sometimes begins with a simple question. I nodded, not quite sure how someone like me was supposed to respond to that. After a moment, she turned and walked back toward the center of the atrium, where the nobles were gathering once again. The ceremony resumed, the quiet hum of palace life continuing as if nothing unusual had happened. But I knew better. As I packed away my tools and prepared to leave the atrium, I glanced once more toward the vast windows overlooking the stars beyond the palace walls. The Australian Empire still stretched across thousands of light years, powerful and ancient beyond anything humans had ever built. Yet somewhere inside its heart, a small adjustment had just been made. And like every well-balanced system, even the largest empire could move forward in a better direction once someone finally noticed the smallest detail.